Coming up.
You mentioned our launch capabilities. Can you just describe to me what are our current launch capabilities in this country?
Also forgot to mention that Mr. Bezos has been called out this past weekend for not providing an editorial opinion with as it relates to endorsing a candidate in the U.S. election.
How vulnerable are our satellites if they were to be hijacked or disabled by our adversaries via cyber attack?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
You mentioned our launch capabilities. Can you just describe to me what are our current launch capabilities in this country?
Currently, there is no launch capability that we have as sovereign as Canada, but there are programs and mission control launch in Halifax that's actually starting a launch capability, and another that I'm aware of. So right now, there's no launch capability, but two that are in progress to actually launch, I think, in the short term.
How do you protect Canadian civilians? We talked about AI in the satellites, and for a military application, there's certain things that we want to get out of that that may not be, the public may not be comfortable with. How do you go about, protecting the public, communicating that no, don't worry, the satellite is for military application. We're not spying on you. We're not targeting you. How can you square that away?
We're launching this AI mission Q2 next year, and the big thing to note is that there's very specific applications of this deep learning. They do one very specific thing. This is not a large learning language model like ChatGPT. It can't be repurposed to do something else. It's only going to go up and do the thing it's going to do. It's going to do that thing better than another implementation of software. And by demonstrating it, we can then prove that. And I think the other thing I would say is, with the Canadian safeguards in place, we can make sure that the public is protected and safe. If it's not a Canadian capability, then the Canadian government, Canadian people have no control over it.
If I look, though, at the issue of Mr. Musk and the politics of some of his positions that he has, whether it's related to Taiwan or whether it's related to Russia, some in the media, some in government positions, some in the U.S., a NASA administrator just called for an investigation into the claims that Mr. Musk has been regularly in contact with Mr. Putin since 2022. It's a sticky situation there, right? So the increasing reliance of government on the private sector, and when the private sector then has these political positions that may not jive with the government's, there's an issue. There's security issues there. Can I get your response on how governments, whether it's Canada or our allies, deal with an increasing reliance on the private sector, where the private sector entity may have different positions than we do from a security perspective or otherwise?
A great question. I think from my viewpoint, number one, I think it talks to the requirement to make sure we have a sovereign capability with regard to Canada, number one. Number two is that I think the parameters of that relationship have to be very well documented up front and understood going into this, so we can't get in something where you're talking a use case that you something has happened that you said we don't understand why this is happening. So that relationship with industry well documented up front with regard to how we're going to work together, not just today, but for many years, is critical at the onset of the meeting, not 10 years into it, at the onset of that relationship. And I think with that, then regular governance around the relationship with regard to how things are being run are critical, so that there's a check-in with regard to what is being done, and are you aligned with regard to the service that you're getting per the instructions before the agreement on the contract.
Mr. Reid, same question. In terms of, I also forgot to mention that Mr. Bezos has been called out this past weekend for not providing an editorial opinion with as it relates to endorsing a candidate in the U.S. election, and some are claiming that it's tied to his space activity with Blue Origin and former President Trump. Can you comment on those sticky situations that exist as it relates to the politics of space?
I'm also not going to state a position about my political leanings in this room. I think it's, as Mr. Ford said, I think that there potentially are ways where we can build in, elements of a contract, requirements around control flow within an organization. So Mr. Musk seems to maintain a lot of control over, say, Starlink. I'm going to turn it off, turn it on. I think there's ways that if a Canadian company was providing a communications service or a robotic service or something else in space, and the government was procuring that as one of the customers, again, ideally as a service, I think there's ways that the contract can say, we have the ability to make these decisions, not you as an executive, not you as a board or an individual person. And I think, again, there are also differences between, Canadian publicly traded companies like Calian and Mr. Ford and SpaceX, right, where this is completely privately owned, don't know who the investors are and don't know what that control looks like. So I think I would certainly echo Mr. Ford's comment that it's a further argument to have domestic space capabilities. Otherwise, then we are also beholden to Mr. Musk if we want to launch Canadian satellites. We currently are, as he essentially has a monopoly. So let's find a Canadian rocket company that's going to launch from Canadian soil, the Canadian defense satellites, and at least step ourselves away from that question.
Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
How vulnerable are our satellites if they were to be hijacked or disabled by our adversaries via cyber attack?
If they were attacked or disabled, they wouldn't serve the purpose that they were sent to out there to do. And so what's vulnerable is the services that Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces expect from them, take for granted from them.
So geopositioning, what sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, everything in space, GPS enables every bank transaction, absolutely. Those are not Canadian satellites. We leverage, satellites that were paid for and built by the American military to provide GPS for free to us that we then leverage. But all the satellites that Canada has built, RadarSat constellation mission, as our radar satellites provide, critical information for us in terms of monitoring our Earth and, climate change and forest fires and all sorts of different applications. With those go away, it's very difficult for us to see what's going on.
Happens if we're attacked? How vulnerable are Canadian satellites?
I think from a vulnerability perspective, I would say, like all industries, satellite, our communications infrastructure, power, any of the critical infrastructure, we have to look at it with the same light. We have to be doing assessments against the vulnerability, the capability for vulnerabilities, and looking at how we best position ourselves to protect ourselves against those vulnerabilities. I see this no different than we look at our 5G networks, our banking systems, our energy systems. And I think right now the challenge obviously with space is they're in space. So these things have to be designed and built in as we launch these new capabilities.
So how do we deal with these vulnerabilities? How would we defend our satellites from adversarial, space-fearing nations or non-state actors if they were to mount a cyber attack to deny the use of our satellite infrastructure?
I think that's working with organizations like defense, national defense, and cyber with regard to building in capability as we design these satellites. It's something that we have to do proactively. The cyber, as you know, the cyber landscape continues to get more complicated as we start thinking about AI in cyber and quantum in cyber. So let's agree that this is a challenge that we need to basically be working on proactively with industry and government and national defense at the table, and our allies, frankly.
Confident are you with that our armed forces cyber defense infrastructure if an aggressive state or a non-state actor were to target our satellites and the infrastructure that supports it?
I would prefer to let national defense answer that question, to be honest. I think they're in a better position because I'm not in the understanding of all the elements of what DND is doing today to protect those satellites. So I think DND is probably, if you have a position on that. Yeah.
No, I don't have a position. I would just add that part of the reason Mr. Ford and I wouldn't be in a position to answer that question is that we don't have, the top secret level clearance that we would need to understand all of what the threats are, which is part of the challenge on innovation, because our companies could potentially be providing solutions that could help mitigate against those threats. But we don't always know those threats because those threats are classified. We can't get that classification level until we're under contract with the Canadian government to provide something. But we can't get under contract to provide something with the Canadian government until we know what the threat, what we're going to develop to fix the threats. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario there. And so I don't think either of us can answer the threat level.
Okay, so you don't even know if you're confident in our defense infrastructure. Are there any capabilities aside from the threat of cyber attacks and anti-satellite weapons at their disposal to deny or disrupt the usage of our satellites? Are there any other things that I'm not mentioning?
Now, the ones you've talked about, both in cyber, I think any kind of taking over a satellite or taking out a satellite, which is also a challenge. I think we have to recognize that those are challenges and threats. I think building resilience into our networks like we do on the ground and we do in space is going to be critical to help counter that threat. Again, that's work, I think, working with government, with national defense, with our allies, on how to best do that. There's no easy answer to that question, for sure, but I'm confident with planning we can get there.
Has CSE ever established regular communications with your company or organization, warning you of any significant cyber threats or vulnerabilities?
Did you say?
Yes.
We are not, I'm not aware of us having direct communication with CSE on that today.
Do you have any communications, regular communications with any of the cybersecurity organizations within government? CSIS, for example.
We provide, as Calian, cyber services. So in that context, yes, we have discussions with government on cyber. In context of the use cases or anything that we're committed or on contract to do, there's discussions around the cyber requirement for that. So I think there's ongoing dialogue, but it's generally specific to a topic or either a contract that we have today.
Looking at longer term, we look at, especially from the standpoint of what's important in Arctic sovereignty and protecting the threats that are coming at us over the top of the globe. What role can Canadian industry play in making sure that we have the right assets and infrastructure in space? Is it more low Earth orbit satellites? Is it more ground-based North Warning system? Is that going to be archaic within the next year or two, never mind today, as well as the complete amalgamation of various platforms, whether it's unmanned or not?
From an opportunity perspective, this is the opportunity because we have opportunity to create all of it. We have companies like Calian that can do a lot of the ground infrastructure, companies like MD and Telesat can build the pieces. You've got companies like Mr. Reed's company that can actually bring an AI component to it. So I think that's the opportunity, is all of it's relevant in Canadian industry construct. There's really nothing I don't think we can actually take on and build with the right framework and governance around that. Mr. Reed may want to comment on that with regard to the capability.
Well, just with, having an understanding of what the Canadian government, Canadian Armed Forces needs are in the longer term and having that stated, then industry can position themselves by going out as a startup. We can raise capital and say, look, we know the government needs this, so we're going to go raise that capital, we're going to build that capability, and then ideally find a way to sell it into the government where we're not waiting for an RFP in a very long time frame, but we are launching a capability and saying it's up there, and one of our many customers could then be the Canadian government procuring that particular service. In the case of my company, maybe it's an onboard AI that's telling you right now there's a dark ship. This is where it is, or this is where a forest fire, whatever the application is. Maybe we have other customers as well, maybe other government departments.
Unfortunately, I have to leave it there. I apologize again. Madame Lambropoulos.